The 9,380th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I give the representative of the Russian Federation the floor.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Прежде чем вы утвердите повестку дня, я бы хотел выразить принципиальное несогласие с подходом председательства к приглашению на сегодняшнее заседание делегации по правилу 37. В нарушение сложившейся практики британское председательство единолично приняло решение предоставить возможность выступить 8 государствам-членам ЕС и НАТО и их ближайшим союзникам, а также представителю самого Евросоюза. Это при том, что по устоявшейся практике в заседаниях по Украине по правилу 37 участвует не более 3 стран. Очевидно, что сегодняшние участники, руководствующиеся натовской дисциплиной, никакой добавленной стоимости для дискуссии не принесут. При этом она затянется, превращаясь в дебаты, проведение которых с членами Совета Безопасности Великобритании не согласовывало. Такой подход не только свидетельствует о...
This approach not only attests to the unscrupulousness of the presidency, but also represents an attempt to exert pressure on the members of the Security Council. There are no and can be no reasonable explanation for the need to transform Security Council meeting into a NATO so-called hangout. But the British presidency has no concern, apparently, neither for its own reputation nor for the rules and traditions of the United Nations Security Council. It has not drawn any conclusions from even its own errors as president of the Security Council, errors which have accumulated significantly in the first half of the month of July. Let us recall that in the month of February, we encountered an attempt by one of the members of the EU presiding and attempting to transform a meeting on Ukraine into a political show directed to coincide with the visit of European ministers to New York, and we see the same today. Let us observe that London, time after time, demonstrates blatant disregard for the procedures and the practices of the Security Council, placing the national position and interests of NATO above the obligations as presidency of the UN Security Council, which has been entrusted with guardianship, I stress this, guardianship of procedures the conduct of balanced and impartial policy. Unfortunately, for the second consecutive year, this basic task was something which was beyond the capacity of British diplomats. Thank you.
Representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Nothing more. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Austria, Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary-General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, Excellencies, over 500 days since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, life in Ukraine remains a living hell, as the Secretary General characterized it. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, 9,287 civilians have been killed and 16,384 injured, most under Russian armed forces fire. This figure includes 537 children killed and 1,117 injured. And these are only confirmed figures. The actual number of victims is likely considerably higher. Children have been particularly hit hard by the conflict. Ukraine was the country with the highest number of children killed and maimed in 2022. It was also the country with the most attacks on schools and hospitals. Nowhere is safe in Ukraine. On 27 June, Russian missiles hit the city of Kramatorsk, reportedly killing 11 people, including 14-year-old twin sisters. At least 60 others were injured. On 6 July, bombardments hit Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv, which are far from the front lines. On 8 July, Russian artillery shelling reportedly killed at least 8 civilians and wounded 13 in Lyman. And communities in the Sumy region continue to be under constant Russian shelling. Civilians in areas under Russian control also face mortal danger. On 9 July, 4 civilians were killed and many more injured while receiving humanitarian aid in the town of Orahiv, Zaporizhia region. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, wherever they may occur, are indefensible and strictly prohibited under international law. They must cease immediately. Mr. President, as the Secretary General has consistently underlined, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. The United Nations remains fully committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, in accordance with relevant General Assembly resolutions. The parties involved bear the responsibility to avoid actions that could further escalate tensions. In particular, any threat to use nuclear weapons is utterly unacceptable. So is jeopardizing the safety and security of nuclear power plants and other critical infrastructure. In recent days, experts of the International Atomic Energy Agency have heard a series of explosions apparently taking place some distance away from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. They are a stark reminder of potential nuclear safety and security risks facing the facility during the military conflict in the country. Mr. President, the United Nations and humanitarian partners continue to respond to the dire consequences of the war, having reached over 5 million people with aid so far this year. There have been over 65 interagency convoys this year to frontline areas. Unfortunately, the continuing lack of humanitarian access to Russian-controlled areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions deprives an estimated 3.7 million people of much-needed assistance. We continue to engage the authorities in Moscow and Kyiv to secure access and urge Russia to fulfill its international obligations to grant humanitarian access to territories it controls. Access is also an issue in the wake of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. The incident has devastated local communities along the Dnipro River and continues to have broad, long-term environmental consequences. The flooding affected local ecosystems, exposed military and hazardous waste, and shifted landmines. The UN is undertaking a post-disaster needs assessment to determine the wider impact in support of a comprehensive recovery strategy. Displacement throughout Ukraine remains a serious concern. Currently, more than 6.3 million Ukrainians are refugees, and an estimated 1.5 million people are internally displaced. According to the International Organization for Migration, an estimated 4.76 million displaced people have returned to their communities since the beginning of the war, including 1.1 million refugees. The High Commissioner for Refugees reports that while most of the remaining refugees and IDPs want to return to their places of origin, voluntary return in safety and dignity may not be possible for many, given the security situation. Indeed, Ukraine has become one of the most heavily mined countries in the world. As part of our support to the government of Ukraine for the reconstruction and repair of critical infrastructure, the UN is assisting the country's emergency services to remove over 500,000 landmines and pieces of unexploded ordnance, enabling 4 million people to return home. Mr. President, OHCHR has documented a harrowing record of human rights violations, including arbitrary deprivation of life, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, torture and ill treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence. According to the latest OHCHR report, the Russian Federation arbitrarily detained 864 individual cases, many cases amounting to forced disappearance. It is deeply disturbing that more than 91% of civilian detainees held by the Russian Federation were reportedly subjected to torture or ill treatment, including sexual violence. More than 26% of the detainees were transferred to other locations in violation of international law, either in Ukraine under Russian control or to the Russian Federation itself. We're also gravely concerned about the alleged summary execution of 77 civilians while they were arbitrarily detained by the Russian Federation, as reported by OHCHR. OHCHR has documented 75 cases of arbitrary detention by Ukrainian security forces, mostly of persons suspected of conflict-related criminal offenses. In 57% of the cases, OHCHR documented the use of torture and ill treatment. We call for the arbitrary detention of civilians to stop and for the immediate release in conditions of safety of all persons held arbitrarily. Victims must be provided with effective remedies. We also urge the Russian Federation to guarantee independent monitors, including those of OHCHR, regular, unimpeded, and confidential access to all detainees. All victims of human rights violations deserve justice and accountability, whichever side of the front line they come from. Impunity must not be allowed to stand. Mr. President, the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London last month was a demonstration of international solidarity, raising over $60 billion in pledges toward Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. The UN will continue to support national and international partners in ongoing recovery efforts following Building Back Better and Leaving No One Behind principles. Mr. President, globally in 2023, it's projected that 345 million people across 79 countries where the World Food Program is operational and data is available will experience acute food insecurity. Up to 40.4 million people across 51 countries face severe hunger emergencies and are one step away from falling into famine if they do not receive immediate assistance. The Black Sea Initiative enabled the safe export of some 33 million metric tons of foodstuffs from 3 Ukrainian ports, including more than 750,000 metric tons of wheat transported by WFP, helping to relieve hunger in Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. The initiative helped bring down global food prices. The Memorandum of Understanding on Russian food and fertiliser exports also delivered concrete results over the past year. As the Secretary General stated this morning, the decision of the Russian Federation to terminate the Black Sea Initiative will strike a blow to people in need everywhere. The Secretary General also stated that this decision will not stop our efforts to facilitate the unimpeded access to global markets for food products and fertilizers from both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Mr. President, we knew well before 24 February 2022 that the world was at an inflection point. We understood that we needed to take urgent action to deal with an overwhelming set of crises that, collectively, threaten our very existence. International cooperation and respect for the rule of law were more important than ever. Today, it is clear that, in addition to causing unconscionable death and destruction, The war in Ukraine has greatly diminished our ability to face an uncertain future. It has heightened tensions in different regions and risks triggering a global arms race. The war threatens to undermine the very structures that prevented a third global conflagration and helped us resolve multiple conflicts over the last 80 years. The longer this war continues, the more dangerous its consequences, including the possibility of a wider conflict. For the sake of the Ukrainian people and for the sake of our global community, this senseless, unjustified war must stop. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. More than 500 days have now passed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At least 9,000 innocent civilians lie dead, including 500 children. Thousands more Ukrainians have been kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured. Homes, businesses, schools, and hospitals have been reduced to rubble. Russia's incessant attacks have knocked out 60% of Ukraine's power supply. This war has claimed countless victims. I'm going to focus on those who have been forcibly deported in this war and those who are going hungry as a result of it. In Kyiv last month, I met a teenage boy. I will call him Dennis. When the Russians captured his hometown, they told Dennis and his classmates that they were going to go on a holiday. They were, in fact, transported to a Russian camp where they were neglected, indoctrinated, and abused. Dennis's distraught mother was desperately searching for him, but the Russians, pretending to look after Dennis and countless others, told him his parents had abandoned him. The boy's ordeal lasted for 7 months before his mother, thanks to the charity Save Ukraine, found him and brought him home. But 19,000 Ukrainian children remain in Russian camps, and their parents are desperately searching for them. A further 2.5 million Ukrainian men and women have been deported to Russia. These are barbaric crimes. Russia is trying to erase Ukrainian identity and cultural history, and they are using children as an instrument of war. But the world is watching, and Russia will be held accountable. We welcome the International Criminal Court's investigation, and we will leave no stone unturned until the responsible are brought to justice. Ukrainians are Russians' principal victims, but this war is also harming the poor and the vulnerable across the world, particularly in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. Energy prices rocketed by 20% worldwide last year, almost doubling global inflation from 4.7% to 8.7%. World food supplies have fallen sharply. Ukrainian food exports, maize, barley, or wheat, have plummeted by more than 40%, with catastrophic consequences for sub-Saharan Africa, which relies on these supplies. Food prices are rocketing by a staggering 332% in Lebanon last summer. Some of these losses were offset by the Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by the UN Secretary General and Turkey. But today, Russia has announced it is refusing to extend it and is taking a colossal 23 million tons of Ukrainian food off of world markets over the forthcoming year. As the UN Secretary General said this morning, today's decision by the Russian Federation will strike a blow to the people in need everywhere. And we call on Russia to return to the table and agree to extend the Black Sea Grain Initiative indefinitely and to implement it fully without delay. Let us be clear. Russia's actions are taking food out of the mouths of the poorest people across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. We cannot allow this war to go on for another 500 days. The UN General Assembly has called repeatedly for peace, a peace that is based on the principles of the UN Charter and our shared belief that might does not equal right. President Zelensky's 10-point plan has shown a way forward. Ukraine wants peace. We want peace. The whole world wants peace. Peace will bring home Ukraine's lost children and feed the hungry of the world. Peace will keep the promises we all made in the UN Charter, and peace will pave the way to a reformed multilateral system. And peace will help deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. A just and lasting peace is what we all want. The Russian Federation can choose peace today by withdrawing all Russian forces from Ukraine. Mr. Putin, bring your troops home. End this war now. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Catherine Colonna, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of the Republic of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, our Council met at ministerial level on the 24th of February after 365 days of an abominable war chosen by Russia alone. The previous day, the General Assembly had once again called on Russia to cease its aggression, but it has continued. For more than 500 days now, Russia has been waging a war of aggression against Ukraine. For 500 days, it has been destroying, bombing, and deliberately targeting civilian populations and infrastructure. For 500 days, it has been committing atrocities and war crimes, abducting and deporting thousands of children, using rape as a weapon of war, torturing and killing. This is 500 days too many. We founded the United Nations at the end of the Second World War with a collective commitment to ensure that the horrors of war would never happen again, to prioritize the peaceful settlement of disputes and to respect common rules and principles that govern relations between states. These are the principles and the rules that Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, with, in this regard, a special responsibility, has chosen to violate by attacking a neighbouring country for no reason. What is at stake in Ukraine concerns all our states. Firstly, because this aggression, by openly calling into question the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, creates a risk of setting a precedent. And secondly, because the way in which we respond to it will largely determine our collective stability and security for decades to come. All of those who might be tempted to think that this war is too far away, that it's a European affair, that it doesn't concern them, should realise this. If we accept might prevailing over right, sovereignty and territorial integrity being flouted with impunity, the aggressor and the aggressed being placed on an equal footing, then we will be contributing to creating the conditions for other wars. Let there be no doubt, if we allow this aggression to be rewarded, there will be other aggressions, there or elsewhere. This war concerns us all here also because its consequences are weighing heavily on people around the world, particularly those in the poorest and most vulnerable countries, and because Russian aggression is having too many adverse consequences everywhere. While Russia pretends to show solidarity but offers nothing to help others, we organise a summit in Paris on the 22nd and 23rd of June for a new global financial pact, which led to tangible results, including on debt management. It set a clear course for mobilising funding for the countries that need it most. While Russia deploys its militias to plunder the resources of the African continent, France has increased its development partnerships and become the world's fourth largest donor of official aid. While Russia is unacceptably subjecting the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative to blackmail And while it is Russia that is hindering freedom of movement in the Black Sea, the European Union is pursuing and improving its solidarity corridors, which have enabled the export of more than 38 million tons of grain. President, after 500 days of an illegal, unjustifiable, and doomed war of aggression, it's essential that we step up our rallying behind the cause of peace. In this respect, I would like to welcome the many initiatives that have emerged in recent weeks. They show that the commitment to the ideal on which the UN was founded remains largely shared. But our efforts will only be meaningful if they create the conditions for a just and lasting peace, respecting the fundamental principles of the Charter, that is, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Let us be clear. Any solution leading to the ratification of the illegal annexation of whole swathes of Ukrainian territory by Russia would only pave the way for future conflicts. Thinking otherwise would be a fatal error. We must respond to this aggression, which has violated all the principles in which we believe here at the United Nations, with solutions based on law and justice. That's why the fight against impunity for the crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine is so important. And that's why the safety and security of Ukraine's civilian nuclear facilities is a priority at a time when Russia is irresponsibly endangering them by occupying Zaporizhia. We will also remain committed to the protection of civilians and to helping the nearly 18 million people who need humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Ukraine, a country that was attacked when it posed no threat whatsoever to Russia, continues to seek dialogue and has placed all these principles at the heart of its vision for peace, which has been constantly reiterated since last year. And that is why we support it. This support will endure for as long as necessary. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Colonna for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States of America and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing. As I prepared for today's meeting, I thought back to the days leading up to President Putin's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was just over 500 days ago. For weeks, the United States, alongside many countries represented in this room, had been sounding the alarm about Russia's imminent invasion. But all Russia did was deny, deny, deny. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister told us to stop the hysteria. But only a few days later, we were all here in this room, in this very council, when Russia launched its brutal war of aggression. That night, President Biden delivered a message that would prove prescient. He said that Putin's war of choice, and I quote, will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering, unquote. Tragically, the world has watched this play out in horrifying detail in Ukraine and around the world. After all, the spillover effect of this needless war are profound. Just look at the harm Russia has done to the world's food supply. By weaponizing food, Russia has exacerbated the global food security crisis, a crisis that disproportionately impacts people in the Middle East and Africa. And today, in another act of cruelty, Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This arrangement has brought stability to global food markets and lowered food prices for all. It has bolstered the World Food Programme's humanitarian work in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. And according to the UN, nearly 2/3 of the wheat exported through this arrangement has gone to developing countries. As the Secretary General said, quote, today's decision by the Russian Federation will strike a blow to people in need everywhere, unquote. Of course, this decision follows Russia's callous veto of a compromise Security Council resolution that would have extended life-saving assistance to Syrians in dire need. In both cases, Russia's cynicism is instructing the will of this council, and it's obstructing the recommendations of the Secretary General. We must all urge Russia to extend the cross-border mechanism into Syria and continue its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Colleagues, over the past 500 days, Russia has waged a campaign of brutality on the Ukrainian people. Russia's forces have rained missiles down on Ukraine, causing unconscionable death and destruction. We've all seen the images of bummed out homes and schools and playgrounds. Russia's forces have tortured civilians in detention, including through beatings, electrocution, and mock executions. One woman I met in Kyiv could only share a portion of the horrors she experienced while in detention. It was still too raw, but the pain etched onto her face said it all. The United States has determined that members of Russia's forces and other Russian officials have committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Rape, summary executions, the deportation of Ukrainians, including children. The list goes on. Russia continues to deny these atrocities. These crimes have been well documented, and the international community has taken steps to hold those responsible to account, and there will be justice. On the night of the invasion, President Biden also said the United States and our allies would respond in a united and decisive way, and this too has been borne out. We have stood united, never wavering in our support for Ukraine. Together, we have imposed sanctions on individuals and entities that provide political and economic support to Russia's war efforts. And together, we have provided and will continue to provide Ukraine with humanitarian and security assistance. Now you hear our Russian colleagues say that somehow this assistance is the reason the war continues. But once again, Russia is trying to turn reality on its head. The security assistance, including weapons, the United States and more than 50 other countries are providing is for Ukraine's self-defense. Self-defense to which Ukraine has an inherent right, as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. The truth of the matter is this: Russia could end this war today by pulling out its troops. It's that simple. And you've heard that from several of us in this room. Colleagues, the United States refuses to give up on the urgency of peace. And that's why, along with Ukraine and other member states, we supported the UN General Assembly's resolution that called for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Russia tried to bully countries into voting against this resolution, but its efforts were in vain. Over 140 member states made clear that peace must be rooted in the UN Charter, in the fundamental principles of sovereignty, equality, and territorial integrity of states. But up to this point, Russia has shown no true interest in a just and durable peace. And as a result, the Ukrainian people continue to suffer. The world continues to suffer. I suspect, actually I know, Russia will continue to follow its standard playbook and deny the truth about its war of aggression. It will continue to call bogus council meetings and invite conspiracy theorists to brief us. It truly is shameful. But what cannot be denied is this: the Ukrainian people will continue to courageously defend their country. And the United States will stand with them for as long as it takes, just as we will continue to stand up for the UN Charter and its principles as the basis for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Miss Thomas Greenfield for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Shunsuke Take, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for calling this important meeting. I also thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo for the briefing. And welcome the participation for Foreign Minister Kuleba of Ukraine on this meeting. Mr. President, I condemn Russia for taking the rest of the world hostage. It is deeply regrettable that Russia chose to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative and blames others for the crisis it has created by its aggression. Japan condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. Russia must immediately and unconditionally withdraw its forces from Ukraine and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity with its internationally recognized borders. Japan will stand with Ukraine as it defends itself for a just and lasting peace. We should not tolerate the clear violation of the UN Charter. The same applies anywhere in the world. If a permanent member of the Security Council unilaterally attempts to change the status quo of territories of its neighbors by force or coercion, it should be held accountable and face consequences commensurate with their privileges. Mr. President, Russia abuses the veto power. The veto is not for impunity. It should embody heavy responsibilities of the permanent members. In this regard, Japan welcomes the commitment of France, the UK, and the US to voluntarily refrain from use of the veto. I hope that the remaining permanent members will join them. Russia is trying to threaten the world with irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, the deployment of the nuclear weapons in Belarus, and the seizure of the militarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. Japan cannot accept Russia's nuclear threats, let alone its use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances. Mr. President, we have admitted that the credibility of the Council is eroding. The Security Council should be reformed to restore the trust of the international community and represent the world of today, not the world of 80 years ago. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Take for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Rosemary for the insightful briefing, as always, with accurate and indisputable information on the matter. We thank the UK Presidency for convening this high-level meeting on the situation of Ukraine and welcome you, Foreign Secretary, on the chair. After more than 500 days of ongoing war in Ukraine, what we have said since the very beginning of this lunacy remains true. It is an unjust and unjustifiable war of choice, a one-man-made catastrophe, a pure act of aggression. During all this time, in our almost weekly debates, we have heard everything and its contrary. We have seen officials declare here pompously, looking straight into the eyes of the Security Council members, that there will be no war. And it was a lie, and everyone knows, including everyone in the Global South. Then, when war began, they rushed to specify that it was only a special military operation, otherwise an aggression. Then they claimed that Russia never commits crimes despite overwhelming and sickening evidence of cruelty, which has, among others, led the ICC to issue arrest warrants for the top leadership. Then they claimed that Russia never attacks civilian infrastructure except for the residential areas, shopping malls, power generation installations, health facilities, schools and kindergartens, and everything else. If Samuel Beckett were alive, he would be jealous. The theater of absurd is thriving in Russia. Russian propaganda has never lost an occasion to claim that despite all the devastating consequences of the war, there were no facts and everything was staged by Ukraine, pushed by the Western hysteria. Until a Russian in the highest Kremlin circles of power, the infamous leader of the notorious Wagner Group, the assembly line of atrocities, a killing machine 100% owned and financed by the government to do the dirty job, would come out and claim that the invasion of Ukraine was nothing less and nothing more than, and I quote, a racket perpetrated by a corrupt elite chasing money and glory without concern for the Russian lives. They've said it. Hard to do better with more accuracy. Colleagues, we have heard so many times that Russia is falling out with the international rules-based order. They claim repeatedly that they do not agree with it and they want out. I think it's important to understand what this is all about. The rules-based international order, which my country, Albania, and the overwhelming majority of the world, and 143 at the last count in the General Assembly, want and protect is everything we have commonly built over 78 years together, bit by bit, to shift from the culture of war to the shared desire for peace and cooperation. It relies on the foundations of the Charter of the UN, in the dozens of conventions and treaties, the countless UN Security Council and UNGA resolutions, court rulings, all that precious international legislation that we commonly call the international law. It is the order where, despite their wealth and might, nations are equal, free to decide on their choice and their future, where relations between states are based on friendship and respect and genuine efforts to achieve mutual benefits, where rules and commitments are respected and observed, where we all, including Russia, have committed to work for peace, not preparing for the next war. It is the international order that Russia doesn't want anymore, because it wants to evolve against instead of together, because it wants to dictate the geopolitical choices of others, including Ukraine, because it wants to impose its imperial ambitions and consolidate the influence of what they call the near abroad, in what they see and call again the Russian world. Last year, food insecurity sent shock tremors across the world until the Black Sea Initiative was put in place. Now Russia just ended it, gambling again with the needs and food of people in need. It is for everyone to judge. Colleagues, Russia's massive assault on a sovereignty country threatens not only Europe, it assaults the astonishing human effort we all have invested since World War II to build global peace through the international rule of law. Let's make it clear. The defeat of Russia in Ukraine doesn't mean the end of Russia. It means the end of aggression and transgression of rules established and accepted globally in favor of a sustainable peace in Europe and the world. Instead, a victory of Russia signifies the prevalence of imperial powers The sanction of war as a means to dominate its neighbors. We don't want any of this, and we cannot accept it. This is why support for Ukraine must continue until Russia understands that its logic of force has failed, and including, Mr. President, by reverting to a lesson of history which tells that wars, however long, do not last forever, and Russia's war of choice will end as well. The sooner, the better for all, for Ukrainians and for Russia itself. This is why the door of diplomacy should remain open. We fully support the Ukraine's peace formula for a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace. It should respect the independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders as protected by international law and the UN Charter. Any other solution will not lead to a lasting peace, but only to a postponement of conflict. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo for her informative briefing and express my appreciation to you, Foreign Secretary Cleverly, for presiding over this meeting. I also welcome the other distinguished ministers and high-level representatives who have joined us today. The toll that the war in Ukraine is exacting on civilians is enormous. Further afield, the consequences of conflict have reverberated across the globe. Since the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding on the export of Russian fertilizers and food products were agreed almost 1 year ago, they have had significant impact globally. The shift in the price of grain following the announcement of the initiative's termination this morning reflects its importance. The UAE regrets that the agreement will not continue, and Ukrainian food items will struggle to reach those who depend on them. Though this remains a political decision, it is the most vulnerable who are now forced to grapple with the very real consequences of the decision. The initiative is one of the few positives that have emerged in the context of this conflict. These agreements were born out of a resolute commitment to dialogue, and it is our hope that dialogue will prevail among the parties. Mr. President, the world has witnessed more than 500 days of suffering since the beginning of the war. It is difficult to convey the true cost of this conflict. One can speak of the millions who have been displaced, the tens of thousands killed and injured, and the impossible situation faced by those living amidst the shifting front lines. One can speak of the destruction wrought by the war and the long journey towards reconstruction that awaits Ukraine. One can also speak of the intangible impacts, the broken families, the uprooted communities, and the traumatized children. All will last long after the last bullet is fired. Since the outbreak of war, the World Health Organization has recorded more than 1,000 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, including on medical facilities, personnel, and their means of transport. We reiterate our call on the parties to respect their obligations under international law. We underline the demand made by this Council in Resolution 2286 that all parties to armed conflict ensure the respect and protection of all medical personnel, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. In the last week alone, there have been 2 instances of humanitarian aid workers coming under fire in Kharkiv and Zaporozhye. We urge all relevant authorities to facilitate the life-saving work of humanitarian organizations. This is especially important at a time when humanitarian needs remain significant and civilians are facing continued interruptions to power supplies across the country. For its part, the UAE is distributing $100 million of aid for Ukraine, including the provision of generators and LED lights for civilians, supplies for babies, as well as a grant of $4 million for programs supporting the welfare of orphan children under the Olena Zelenska Foundation. The UAE will continue its humanitarian efforts to help alleviate suffering on the ground. Mr. President, Today's announcement is disappointing, but it should not dissuade our collective efforts to bring the war to an end. The United Arab Emirates will continue to call for this and support all genuine efforts to mitigate the war's consequences. De-escalation and dialogue are necessary to achieve a sustainable and just peace, a peace that is in line with the UN Charter and respects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, it has been 510 days since the war against Ukraine began. Regrettably, today, we are less close to finding a resolution to the conflict than when it started, and deepening differences may cause widespread and long-term damage to multilateralism and our shared ambition for global peace and security. Already, we have seen several thousand lives lost on both sides, whole cities that have been destroyed, safeguards against nuclear facilities that have been jeopardized, amplified and reckless rhetoric on nuclear weapons that have risked lowering the threshold of its use, and the proliferation and use of dangerous weapons that have rolled back our collective ambitions on arms control. The impact of the brutal war on Ukraine has not been limited to its suffering masses. It has cast its dark shadow across the world, aggravating the socioeconomic conditions of many countries that were already reeling from the adverse effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. Evolving national security doctrines are also responding to the war in Ukraine in ways that do not necessarily support the strengthening of our collective security. Mr. President, as I thank the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting and welcome the briefing by USG Rosemary DiCarlo, I appeal that the gaps between the expectations of 1945 and the reality of today should be a reminder of the further efforts all of us need to take in amplifying the voice of peace and establishing credible pathways of dialogue to help Ukraine and the Russian Federation to stop this needless war. On our part, Ghana has three main points that it would like to highlight for this meeting. First, we emphasize the need for the parties to heed the calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities. The militarization of the conflict, fueled by the manifest combative choices of the parties, has not significantly changed the dynamics of the conflict on the ground. Constrained by the absence of a common message from this Council, it is well past time for the parties to heed to the voice of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, which in all its resolutions called for an immediate end to the war in favor of a peaceful settlement. Secondly, bearing in mind the civilian casualties, gross violations of human rights, and the extensive destruction that has accompanied the war, we are compelled to reiterate to the warring parties their obligation to strictly comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, especially the requirement to make a distinction of non-combatant populations to avoid harming them, as well as the facilities critical to their survival. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is morally unacceptable and constitutes violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. We also urge Ukraine and the Russian Federation to embrace the 5 concrete principles put forward by the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency to preserve the safety and security of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We express appreciation for the coordinated humanitarian response spearheaded by the United Nations humanitarian agencies and international partners, as their efforts have been vital in assuring the people of Ukraine that they have not been forgotten by the rest of the world. Thirdly, to manage the adverse impact of the war in Ukraine on third states, it is important that every grain produced should be able to reach the global market. In this regard, we are deeply disappointed that the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which has since its commencement in July 2022, delivered over 32 million tons of food commodities to 45 countries, has not been renewed. A renewal of the initiative, accompanied by a resolution of the challenges with the export of ammonia to global markets, as well as of Russian agricultural products and fertilizers, envisaged by the MOU between the Russian Federation and the United Nations, would help prevent speculative spikes in global food prices, strengthen global food security, and prevent other knock-on effects. Mr. President, in closing, allow me to reiterate the futility of the use of force as an instrument to pursue relations with other states in the present era. It has not served the interests of others well, and it would not do so in the present circumstance. Our common renunciation of war in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter reflects the firm position of the international community on the matter, and our expectation that this obligation and other moderating voices would drive us to seek a path of lasting and comprehensive peace for Ukraine and the Russian Federation through dialogue and diplomacy. Finally, I reiterate Ghana's commitment of support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Our commitment remains undiminished. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, since its outbreak, the Ukrainian crisis has become increasingly protracted, expanded, and complex, with ever more cruelty, danger, and unpredictability. The international community should work together to prevent the situation from getting out of control, achieve a ceasefire and cessation of war sooner to promote a political settlement of the issue. I have 4 points to say. First, we must step up efforts to promote talks for peace. The evolution of the battlefield shows that military means cannot solve the Ukrainian crisis, and the continuation of conflict will only bring more suffering to civilians and may even lead to unpredictable and irreparable situations. No matter how long the crisis lasts, it will eventually be solved through political means. For some time now, rational voices supporting the resumption of talks have become stronger and stronger. Developing countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America have all put forward peace proposals. Though different in contents, they all reflect a strong desire to resolve the crisis through political means. Both parties to the conflict should work together to meet each other halfway, to explore solutions that accommodate each other's concerns, that correspond to regional realities, and that can help bridge differences. The international community should work together to create the necessary conditions for a ceasefire and create a favorable atmosphere for peace talks. The Ukrainian crisis is a major outbreak of security frictions in Europe. There are many lessons worth of profound reflection and thinking. The crisis once again proves that the pursuit of absolute security, inciting bloc confrontation, expanding military alliance, an outdated way of thinking, and dangerous practices that can only bring turmoil and anxiety to Europe and the whole world. The key to the ultimate solution of the crisis is to uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security vision, and promote the construction of a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. Second, we must control the spillover effects of the crisis. The recovery of the world economy after the pandemic has been sluggish. The Ukrainian crisis has interacted with other factors and has dealt a severe blow to global development, bringing fragility to global food, energy, and financial security. And developing countries face more difficulties in achieving sustainable development goals. We should devote our limited financial resources to addressing common global challenges. The countries concerned should immediately stop abusive use of unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction to ensure safe and smooth global industrial chains and supply chains. We should increase support and assistance to developing countries and do more things that are conducive to world economic growth. China appreciates the important role of the Black Sea Grain Transportation Package Agreement in stabilizing world food markets and hopes that relevant parties can properly resolve the Black Sea grain transportation issue through dialogue and consultation. Third, utmost efforts should be made to respond to humanitarian crisis. Millions of people were displaced by the protracted conflict, and many important large infrastructures were destroyed. Parties to a conflict should strictly abide by international humanitarian law, strictly follow the principles of necessity, differentiation, and proportionality, protect civilians and civilian infrastructures, provide rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, and spare no effort to eliminate the suffering of civilians. Women and children are the most vulnerable groups in armed conflict and should be given special care. China encourages the international community and humanitarian agencies, on the basis of abiding by the principles of humanitarian relief, to step up humanitarian assistance to people affected by crisis. The irresponsible transfer of cluster bombs can easily give rise to humanitarian issues. Humanitarian concerns and legitimate military security needs should be handled in a balanced way. Prudence and restraint should be exercised in the transfer of cluster bombs. Fourth, nuclear safety and security must be ensured. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the nearby area have seen increasing military risks, and recently it's been said explosion was heard again from those areas, which is deeply worrying. We once again call on both parties of the conflict to remain rational and maintain restraint as much as possible, abide by nuclear safety conventions and other international laws, and steadfastly avoid man-made nuclear accidents. China supports the IAEA in continuing to maintain contact with all parties and play a constructive role in ensuring the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear facilities. China has always maintained that nuclear weapons should not be used and that nuclear wars cannot be won and should never be fought. We have been calling for all efforts to prevent escalation of conflict into nuclear crisis. Mr. President, on the issue of Ukraine, China's consistent position has been that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be safeguarded, the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN should be complied with, and the legitimate security concerns of all the parties should be respected. All efforts, as long as they are conducive to peaceful settlement of the crisis, deserve our support. We have maintained close communications with the parties to the conflict, other interest parties, and the developing countries in general, and have taken practical measures to actively promote peace talks, alleviate humanitarian crisis, and control spillover effects. In February of this year, China released its position paper on the political solution to the Ukrainian crisis with 12 propositions, including respect for sovereignty, ceasefire, and cessation of war, initiation of peace talks, and cessation of unilateral sanctions, among others. China will continue to use this as a basis and work with the international community to promote a political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. And now I'll give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to commend the United Kingdom's presidency and Your Excellency for taking the initiative of convening this meeting. We thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for our insightful briefing. We welcome the participation in the debate of Their Excellency the Ministers and high dignitaries. Mr. President, as we gather today, the conflict in Ukraine continues unabated, with ever-mounting casualties and growing global ramifications. From the September 11, 2001 attacks to the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and its incursion and spread into Africa, the past 20 years have had no shortage of history-changing conflicts with global implications. To this list of doom, we must now add the conflict in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is a 21st century tragedy. It is unfolding under our constant collective gaze and the scrutiny of the entire world. It is being fought both in the battlefield as well as in the court of a perplexed public opinion. The conflict has so far claimed thousands of lives, destruction of critical socioeconomic infrastructure, and causing global food shortages. It is heralding the return of nuclear brinkmanship. We are disappointed that so far all efforts to end the conflict, including with an African peace initiative, have been in vain. Mr. President, no other matter under the consideration of the Council in the last year and a half has commanded more attention and resources. It is Mozambique's considered view that the continuation of the armed confrontation in Ukraine is not the answer to the interests of the parties and neither of those of the world community at large. There is a danger that failure to solve this conflict, based on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, could erode the trust in the notion of our collective security and our collective responsibility for international peace and security as set out in the Charter. A world thus divided will not be able to master the resources and the political will needed to face countless other global challenges we are confronted with today. These challenges range from climate change to global terrorism, from global health threats to rising inequality. Mozambique has always called for the parties in conflict to take responsibility for protecting civilians. They must ensure compliance with the applicable international law and international humanitarian law. Furthermore, we consider that the parties must exhaust all avenues of dialogue, of a negotiated settlement of the conflict. In this context, Mozambique wishes to reiterate its call for an immediate ceasefire of hostilities. We advocate the return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of urgency and in full respect for the United Nations Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. Now give floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank USG DiCarlo for her sobering and important briefing today. The international community has repeatedly called for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on full support for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including through UN General Assembly resolutions. Malta expresses its support for the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula, which also addresses the broader global ramifications of Russia's aggression on food security, energy security, nuclear safety, and the environment. International humanitarian law and human rights law must be upheld. Russia must immediately stop its illegal and indiscriminate shelling of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The human rights situation in the Russian-occupied territories also constitutes a matter of serious concern. As we just heard from USG DiCarlo, the numbers and statistics in the OHCHR report are harrowing and extremely disturbing. Furthermore, as explained in the findings of the UN International Commission of Inquiry, Russian armed forces have carried out attacks that may constitute war crimes. These include indiscriminate assaults on civilians and civilian infrastructure, execution, torture, unlawful imprisonment, inhumane detention, rape, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, and the unlawful deportation and transfer of children. Holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions and ensuring victims' right to reparation and justice are essential principles. We are fully supportive of ongoing ICC and ICJ processes. We also welcome the setting up of an international center for the prosecution of crime of aggression against Ukraine that will coordinate efforts to collect, preserve, and store evidence, as well as the establishment of the Council of Europe's Register of Damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. President, less than 1 year into the establishment of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, more than 32 million tons of food commodities have been exported to 45 countries across 3 continents. It has proven itself a lifeline to millions, acting as a major defense against global food insecurity, accelerated by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Today, Malta is deeply concerned by the decision of the Russian Federation not to renew this initiative further. This is another example of the politicization of humanitarian needs, which we have already witnessed last week with the Syria file. It is of utmost importance that the Black Sea Grain Initiative is further extended and secured to alleviate pressures on food insecurity all over the globe. The weaponization of food is unacceptable. To conclude, Mr. President, by underlining the fact that the unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine continues to cause severe humanitarian and human rights violations, inflicting deep intergenerational trauma and exacerbating global crisis in food and energy supply. We once again urge the Russian Federation to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally, completely withdraw all its forces and will military equipment from the entire territory in Ukraine. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting. I thank the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, for her briefing. Since the beginning of Ecuador's mandate in the Security Council in January 2023, we have discussed the issue of the military aggression on Ukraine at least a dozen times. These meetings were sometimes focused on the status of the aggression and the prospects for peace. Others focused on the protection of civilians. Others on the protection of freedoms, including the freedom of thought and religious beliefs. Others were focused on arms transfers, issues such as the nuclear safety and security situation in Zaporizhia, or on the breach of the Kakhovka Dam. Some of the meetings were placed on the agenda by the presidency, such as is the case today, or that on the 23rd of February this year. Other meetings were convened at the request of the United States and Albania, others on the request of Ukraine, others on the request of Russia, and others on the request of Ecuador and France, essentially on the humanitarian situation. Over these 6 months, we have heard briefings to this Council from the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the OCHA Coordinator, the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, the Director of the IEA, and as well as representatives and briefers from academia and civil society. The format, the approach, and the agenda topic on which they were convened and the components of these meetings differed. In each case, Ecuador sought to make a genuine contribution to this specific topic. But there is one recurrent element that hasn't changed and will not change, as long as there is no end to the violation of the United Nations Charter and of international law. That is, the practically unanimous call of members of this Council to bring an end to the Russian occupation and military aggression against Ukraine as ordered by the International Court of Justice on the 16th of March 2022, and to make way for a definitive peaceful solution. Here, the General Assembly has also made a strong statement through the resolution on the principles of the UN Charter, underlying a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. The Council should be guided by that decision. Today, I'd like to stress 4 other points. First, we must move from the logic of domination of one state over another by military supremacy to the logic of diplomacy, to avoid a wider conflict and to seek definitive peace. Second, we must recognize the valuable contribution of the United Nations system and its partners on the ground, including OCHA, UNHCR, the IAEA, just to cite a few. Third, we insist on the need for the parties to unreservedly respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. This implies refraining from attacking humanitarian aid workers and their equipment. We urge the Russian Federation to allow humanitarian access to the areas temporarily under its occupation. We encourage the safe exchange of prisoners. We deplore violations of the rights of children and the fact that the protracted invasion continues to claim their lives. 4, we express our utmost disappointment at the announcement by the Russian Federation to withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, just 5 days short of a year into the agreement. With 32 metric tons of food shipped from Ukrainian ports, the initiative was vital for millions of people, including in Afghanistan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. And it prevented an even greater deterioration in world food security. All the more reason why Russia's military aggression on Ukraine should not last one more day, because it's outside the bounds of international law, because it's having consequences on Ukraine, on Russia itself, and because of its global impact. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you,
of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, dear colleagues, I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. Brazil deeply regrets the continuing loss of human life, especially innocent civilians. We extend our solidarity to the families of the victims and to the millions of Ukrainian nationals who find themselves as refugees or internally displaced. Once again, we join our voice to the voices of other members in condemning the attacks against residential areas and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, especially hospitals and schools. We remind that parties in conflict have clear obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. We believe, however, that just the condemnation of illegal actions in the course of this war in itself will not bring us closer to peace. We urge both sides to de-escalate the fighting and initiate discussions on parameters for a comprehensive peace agreement, taking into account Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the legitimate security concerns of all parties in line with principles of the UN Charter. We encourage the parties to seek a peaceful solution to the conflict in accordance with Article 33 of the Charter. This is the core of the many proposals for facilitating dialogue coming from different corners, such as the Peace Initiative of African leaders last month. Massive transfers of highly lethal weapons to the battlefront can further undermine prospects for a peaceful outcome. The increasing flow of weapons into the conflict in Ukraine will only fuel more violence and will not contribute to ending it. The presence of arms and ammunition in large quantities tends to become a destabilizing factor in the long term, compromising the chances of a lasting peace in the region and fueling conflict everywhere. Brazil renews its appeal to the parties to give first priority to the well-being of civilian populations on both sides of the front lines. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine affects us all, including in regions far from the combat zone. Developing countries are particularly vulnerable to the side effects of the war on their economy and their food and energy security. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has made an important contribution to stabilizing international food and fertilizer prices. In recent months, full implementation of the Istanbul agreements has become increasingly difficult, compromising the regularity of trade in agricultural products and inputs through ports in the Black Sea. In the absence of an agreement for a comprehensive and lasting peace, we urge the parties involved to spare no efforts to renew what USG DiCarlo described in one of our previous meetings as a beacon of hope. We welcome the efforts of the Secretary General in the constant search for a compromise between the parties in order to ensure food security and adequate nutrition for millions of people, especially in the least developed countries. This will keep up the hope that, in some way, this conflict will end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, President. First of all, I'd like to thank the United Kingdom for paying particular attention to the situation in Ukraine. I'd also like to thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her very useful briefing. And I welcome here the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, His Excellency Mr. Kuleba. Last month, the second edition of the Conference on the Reconstruction of Ukraine took place in London. In July 2022, Switzerland hosted the first edition of this conference. Both in Lugano and in London, the international community proved its strong determination to support Ukraine in its reconstruction process. Looking ahead to future reconstruction is essential, because in the wake of this military aggression, thousands of people have been killed. Ukraine's infrastructure has been devastated, global food security shaken, and certainties shattered. Allow me to go into further detail here. Firstly, we've just heard this from the Under-Secretary General. The loss of human life in Ukraine is immense. Just last week, civilians lost their lives in the Zaporizhia region while they were receiving humanitarian aid. Added to this, we have the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure, which is a Herculean task to rebuild. It's unacceptable that this toll should continue to rise. We reiterate our call on Russia to immediately begin de-escalating, to cease all combat operations, and to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. We recall that international humanitarian law protects the civilian population and infrastructure. They must never, never become targets. In this context, I would like to express Switzerland's grave concern about the use of anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions in Ukraine. As a state party to the Ottawa and Oslo Conventions, Switzerland calls on all states and parties to the conflict to refrain from using these weapons. Their indiscriminate or disproportionate use is a serious violation of international humanitarian law. Second, restoring global food security is an urgent task. Since the start of the Russian military aggression, millions of people around the world have been suffering from food insecurity. The Istanbul agreements are making a difference for these people. We regret Russia's announcement concerning these agreements, and we hope that they will be renewed in the very near future. Finally, we have seen the resurgence of a spectre that we thought that we had banished: the war of aggression aimed at territorial expansion by one sovereign state against another sovereign state. These are some of those shattered certainties. In the face of these multiple challenges, we must rely on a solid foundation, and we have that foundation. It is the United Nations Charter. One might have thought that a flagrant violation of the Charter would undermine its power. On the contrary, we note that the vast majority of states have reaffirmed its importance. More than 140 states have deplored the aggression against Ukraine. Indeed, the principles of the Charter and the resolution adopted by the General Assembly in February 2023 constitute the basis on which a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace can be built in Ukraine. Switzerland is closely following the various initiatives aimed at moving towards peace, while stressing that Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected. President, there is an urgent need to rebuild Ukraine, but that's not enough. We must also provide justice for the victims. What's more, there's an urgent need to restore global food security. Hunger must never again become a weapon of war. We must therefore continue to close ranks behind international law and, in particular, the United Nations Charter, the shield that protects us all, so that the buildings, the supply chains, as well as peace and stability that we will eventually rebuild are based on a solid and lasting foundation for our humanity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Insofar as today, in this hall, in addition to you, there are many other senior accomplices of the Kiev terrorist regime present who bear full responsibility for its crimes. I wish to first and foremost touch upon where your actions have led us to today in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Before our very eyes, the tragedy is being worsened, the root cause of which was what was provoked by the United States and their Western allies. In the best colonial traditions, the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014. People who, since then, led the Kiev regime were guided certainly not by interests of Ukraine. Contrary to the aspirations of the majority of the Ukrainian people and for the advancement of Western fixations on confrontation with our country, they abandoned peace and good neighborly relations with Russia, a non-discriminatory approach with all nationalities residing in Ukraine, and began by leaps and bounds to advance rabid nationalism and to whitewash Nazi war criminals. Having unleashed 9 years ago a brutal war against Russian language-speaking residents of Donbass, the Kiev regime deliberately and in a targeted way brought the Ukrainian crisis to the point of military confrontation with Russia. Our country had to protect those eliminated by Kiev in the eyes of the so-called civilized Western world, the people, women, children, and the elderly, after Ukraine and its Western sponsors definitively refused to comply with the Minsk agreements, which were approved by the UN Security Council. And as we know perfectly well today, all of these years, this document was a mere smokescreen for Ukraine's preparation by Western states for war with the Russian Federation. For this reason, all of the incantations of our Western colleagues about the alleged unprovoked Russian aggression and the war of choice no longer persuade anybody. Those who are capable of objective analysis can see perfectly clearly that we had no choice, and the time bomb that was detonated on 22 February 2022 was programmed by the West at the minimum in 2014, and actually even earlier than then. Mr. President, as is known, in April of 2022, that is a little more than a month after the beginning of the special military operation, Ukraine rejected a peace plan which was signed onto by its negotiators to resolve the crisis, a plan that stipulated, among other things, international security guarantees for that country. This happened, as we all are aware today, with a direct participation of the United Kingdom, the then leadership of which persuaded the leader of the Kiev regime that with Western support, Ukraine would manage to secure victory over the Russian Federation. Then was when the hot stage of NATO's proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian fully materialized, and Ukraine essentially was transformed into a private military campaign that was hired by Washington, London, and Brussels. And for there to be no way out for the Ukrainian authorities after the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kiev as a gesture of goodwill against the backdrop of the signing in Istanbul of draft peace agreements, an appalling, in essence, and clumsy in implementation provocation was organized in Bucha, Kiev, as many experts believe and have assessed a direct role in organization of this was played by British intelligence services. As for whether or not this is true, an objective investigation which we will carry out will show this. As we all remember, during the British Presidency of the Security Council in April of this year, once again using underhanded procedural maneuvers, prevented a meeting that we requested in connection with this provocation from being carried out, thereby showing itself to be unworthy of presidency of the Security Council and a permanent member of the Security Council, and presenting itself as an accomplice of the Kiev regime. The provocation in Bucha was a necessary smokescreen, which the Ukrainian leadership hid behind instead of peace, choosing to engage in armed confrontation with Russia, and Western countries, instead of diplomatic efforts, have redoubled their efforts to provide assistance and Western weapons to Ukraine. The cost of this fateful decision for Ukraine was hundreds of thousands of dead and maimed young Ukrainians who today the Kiev regime continues to throw into the meat grinder in the eastern and southern fronts, vainly attempting to present to Western sponsors the ability, so-called, of Ukraine to win. And I wish to take this opportunity of the presence of ministers and to emphasize the responsibility of your governments for the ongoing tragedy endured by the people in Ukraine. By systematically inciting that country to engage in war with Russia instead of implementing the Minsk agreements, you were guided by your own geopolitical interests solely in seeking to weaken Russia. For this pipe dream, you engaged in provoking the Kiev regime totalitarian dictatorship to unleash war against its own Russian language residents in the east of the country. For 8 years, you didn't notice how the Ukrainian shells resulted in deaths of women, children, and the elderly. And today, these people are dying as a result of what you have provided, long-range shells and missiles, because Ukrainian ones are no longer reaching Donetsk and other cities. In principle, they have been depleted. And for the suffering of civilians to be even worsened, you've decided to provide the Ukrainian services with the depleted Ukrainian munitions and cluster bombs. And also, you decide not to notice the shelling of Zaporozhye plant by Ukrainian forces, as well as the devastation of the Kakhovka Dam and the open terrorist attacks in Russian territory, which reflect the terrorist essence of the Ukrainian authorities. Today, we learned about the latest terrorist attacks of the Kiev regime targeting the bridge in Crimea, hundreds of kilometers from the area of hostilities. As a result, 2 innocent Russians died, and their 14-year-old daughter was gravely wounded. I have not heard any condemnation of this act of terrorism from any of the Western sponsors of the Kiev regime, and we still have to get to the bottom of the degree to which, in the preparation and conduct of this terrorist attack, there was complicity of Western, including British intelligence services. Far too much points to this. Colleagues, all the facts that I've mentioned points to the fact that there are no crimes that the West is unwilling to commit to preserve its hegemony in global affairs in order to, as was said by Mr. Borrell, for at any cost to preserve the idyllic garden for everybody else to continue to live in jungles. And there are no principles that you are unwilling to breach to achieve this. And I'm saying this for you to harbor no illusions that your countries, including your governments, bear equal responsibility, if not more responsibility, than the Zelensky regime for what is happening in Ukraine. And despite your attempts to portray yourselves as the defender of the poor, unfortunate Ukraine, your actions give the lie to your claims. And the actions of the Kiev regime, including regarding the persecution of followers of the canonical Orthodox Church, you attempt to not notice this, I leave no doubt that even when the regime begins to grab people off the streets and summarily execute those dissenters, those who disagree with the destructive anti-popular policy of the current authorities, is something which you will easily turn a blind eye to. But we will dwell on this in detail during the 26th July meeting we requested. I wish to touch upon another two issues which have to do with the Ukrainian subject. Exactly 9 years ago, in the skies of the Donbass, the MH17 Malaysian Airlines flight was downed. This event directly impacted the crisis inside Ukraine, forcing the Donbass insurgents with a military initiative to stop, in expectation of the imminent, as it seemed then, condemnation of Ukraine for the terrorist act that occurred. As is known, since this disaster, the Russian Federation consistently advocated comprehensive, thorough, impartial, apolitical investigation into the reasons behind the disaster based on facts and incontrovertible evidence. Russia was at the source of the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2166, stipulating the need to conduct a full, thorough, and independent international investigation. However, this has still not been carried out. The circumstances behind what has happened have not been credibly highlighted. The situation carried out by the Netherlands and the criminal investigation by the Joint Investigative Team did not reflect the criteria set out in Resolution 2166. Their real goal was not to establish the truth, but rather to tailor the relevant evidentiary basis to reflect the narrative of Russia's participation in the tragedy. Essentially, the MH17 disaster was nothing other than a key element of a mendacious, unfounded anti-Russia campaign, which was subsequently supplemented by the poisonings of Skripal and Navalny, as well as the Bucha provocation, which I've already mentioned. As is known, the worse and more horrific the lie, the easier it is to believe it. And this is specifically the principle that our Western opponents give pride of place to in all of these instances. On MH17, the Russian Federation provided the investigation with vast troves of information, which had tremendous significance to identify the true causes for the disaster. However, this material was taken into account neither by the investigation nor by the Hague District Court. They preferred dubious sources from social networks, photographs, and video material, which was evidently redacted. Not a single question was put to Ukraine, which refuted to provide radar data and recorded conversations of on-ground flight tracking services, and was unable to explain where the Ukrainian dispatchers who could have shed light on this tragedy, where they disappeared to. In the time that has elapsed since the disaster, there was no due consideration of the question of Kiev's responsibility for opening airspace over the area of hostilities where air defenses, including Buks, were deployed. There was a particular clarity could have been introduced with U.S. satellite data, which were made on the day of the disaster. However, the judge's request to disclose this data, or at least allow access with compliance with certain conditions, were categorically denied by Washington. Unfortunately, the approach embraced by the Netherlands and their cronies is showing the fact that there is a smokescreen. And in this connection, we cannot but sympathize with family and loved ones of the dead who are deliberately denied their right to truth. And not a single Western colleague mentioned this tragedy today. You don't need the facts or the truth about this, and your role in the practice of slandering the Russian Federation has already been carried out. And now to conclude, I wish to touch upon another issue. Today, through Russian embassies in Ankara, Minsk, London, as well as the Consulate General in Istanbul, we circulated official notes about a decision made by the Russian government to end the Black Sea Initiative as of 18 July 2023. Similarly, UN Secretary General and head of OCHA were notified, and they are directly responsible for its implementation. I see no point in delving into the details of how the so-called Istanbul package of Antonio Guterres was actually being implemented, a key component of which is the Russia-UN memorandum. We've already done this repeatedly, including here at the Security Council chamber. Further, as we see now, empty promises, the Secretariat were continued to be carried out by the Secretariat. And however, against the backdrop of the stable export from Ukraine to countries with high-level income countries and middle-income countries of corn fodder and wheat fodder, 90% and 60% of all exports, respectively. Least developed countries received only 3% of those goods, and the World Food Program humanitarian operations received even less of this, 2.2% of wheat. These facts are too unsavory, and they speak to themselves, and so the Black Sea Initiative was, without much ado, simply reformatted from a humanitarian to a commercial one. Against this backdrop, there remained unresolved issues that Russian economic operators continue to encounter. Having announced in March this year of our consent for the extension of the Black Sea Initiative for 60 days on 18 July, we categorically stated that we will take a decision on further steps only after consideration of progress in addressing certain tasks, which we spoke about repeatedly. I will not relist them. At the same time, we pay tribute to the Secretary General and his team for their efforts in attempting to persuade Western countries to comply with obligations before the Russian Federation from the Russia-UN memorandum. However, these were mere smoke and mirrors. However, there has been no progress here, and the Kiev regime continues to use the cover of the open maritime corridor to wage provocations and attacks against Russian civilians and military objects. Against this backdrop, a decision was taken to exit the deal, about which today we informed the Turkish and Ukrainian sides, as well as the UN Secretariat. This means an end to guarantees of safe navigation, curtailment of a maritime humanitarian corridor, restoration of a regime of a temporary dangerous area in the Northwest Black Sea, and reformatting of the Joint Coordination Center. And in this way, without Russia's participation, the Black Sea Initiative ends its operations as of 18 July. The Russian Federation will stand ready to consider its resumption only when concrete results are achieved, rather than promises and assurances from Western capitals. And now, apparently, is the time, clearly, to demonstrate the stated solidarity of Kiev's European allies, who can export Ukrainian food through land corridors. For our part, despite the existing obstacles, we will continue to assume our obligation to fulfill contractual obligations to provide Russian grain to all purchasers. Thank you.
The Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
President, I welcome you in this meeting, and I welcome the other eminent personalities engaged in our discussions today. I'd like to express my thanks to the Undersecretary General, Madam Rosemary DiCaro, for her briefing. The war in Ukraine has over the months become the most discussed topic within this Council, be it the security, humanitarian, or nuclear-related issues. Nonetheless, the violence persists, and this war continues to challenge international peace and stability and to contribute to food insecurity in several regions of the world. Offensives and counter-offensives on both sides raise the spectre of an escalation of violence, an increase in the loss of human lives and property, as well as an ever greater population displacement, thus making the prospects for negotiations for lasting peace ever more remote. The damage caused over these 17 months is immense and very alarming. The latest reports of the Secretary General mention hundreds of attacks on hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure. The number of non-military victims, particularly children, continues to rise. The Security Council must endeavour to find a peaceful solution in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. We call on those countries with any influence on the main players to act so that a real dialogue can be initiated with a view to eventually reaching a lasting peace agreement. In this respect, my country encourages the Secretary General to continue to use his good offices to promote the launch of talks between all parties. It is essential for the international community to support and coordinate the various diplomatic initiatives to promote a negotiated settlement. President, today, the 17th of July 2023, the Black Sea Grain Initiative comes to an end. This is a vital agreement for numerous countries. We remain hopeful that it will be renewed so it can be continued as soon as possible. The constant threat posed by the risk of the nuclearization of this war is also a potential danger that must be avoided. My country reiterates its commitment to the NPT and opposes all politicization, intimidation, and trivialization of the nuclear issue. Nuclear power plants are civilian infrastructure protected by international humanitarian law. They must not be used for military purposes. The humanitarian situation is taking on increasingly critical proportions, as we've heard. We reiterate the need for unimpeded humanitarian access for the most vulnerable people, often living in the areas with the highest security risks. President, to conclude, Gabon reiterates its call for de-escalation and good faith negotiations to bring an end to the conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmitry Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I thank the UK Presidency for convening this meeting. My gratitude also goes to Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing. Today marks 9 years since Russia shot down the civilian airliner MH17 over Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. Ukraine mourns victims of this crime. The case of MH17 is also a prime example of Russian lies and abuse of its illegal presence at the United Nations Security Council. Instead of admitting guilt and cooperating with the investigation, Russia chose to promote conspiracy theories in order to confuse the public. In 2015, Russia shamelessly used its UN veto to prevent the establishment of a relevant international tribunal, despite its own denial of responsibility. The Dutch trial finally put an end to all the Russian nonsense. The court determined that MH17 was hit by a Russian Buk missile fired by armed groups controlled by Moscow, and that the system had been returned to Russia after the strike. The bottom line is that no amount of lies can change the truth and avert justice. In any situation, Russian strategy is kill, lie, and deny. Our strategy should be the opposite: strength, truth, and accountability. Today, we are facing two more situations of this kind. The first one was another set of lies and denials we have heard in this room. The second one is Russia killing the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia is blackmailing the world. This blackmail affects the lives of millions of Ukrainians and tens of millions more around the world, primarily in Africa and Asia, who face the threat of rising food prices and hunger. Ukraine makes no demands in relation to the deal. We simply want it to continue operating and expand its capacity. We want our grain to be freely exported and reach foreign customers all around the globe. At the same time, Russia has been systemically obstructing the initiative's normal functioning. Russia deliberately decreased the number of inspections in the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul, limiting the capacity to 1-2 vessels per day. On April 29th, Russia fully blocked the functioning of Ukraine's Pivdenny seaport. The last grain vessel departed the port of Odessa on July 16th. As of now, Russia has fully blocked the functioning of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, even without announcing its termination. Whatever Russia is saying to excuse its behavior, please note that while blocking our ports, Moscow is increasing exports of its own grain, including the ones stolen from temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Last year, when the initiative was introduced, grain prices around the world immediately dropped. Together with other factors, it had a positive long-term effect. In June 2023, they were 23% lower than in March 2022, when Russia started the illegal blockade of our seaports. The immediate outcome of Russia pulling out of the deal now will be that prices will go up again. Hurting those most vulnerable, primarily in Asia and Africa. Russia must stop playing hunger games with the people around the world. I call on all UN member states to firmly demand that Russia resume its participation in the deal in good faith and stop its hunger games. Russia must keep politics out of global food security. I must also draw the attention of the Council to another threat that Russia poses. Since Russia occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in March 2022, Ukraine and other neighboring nations have been living in fear of a nuclear incident. Russia has violated all 7 nuclear safety and security pillars of the International Atomic Energy Agency by stationing its military at the plant and turning it into a military base. Despite international pressure, Russia refuses to withdraw from the plant. Today, Russia remains in full control and bears full responsibility for the situation there. Russia is also spreading ridiculous conspiracy theories about Ukraine allegedly planning an attack on the plant. Whether it is the downing of MH17, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, or any other major Russian crime, their strategy remains the same: kill, lie, and deny. I take this opportunity to say it again officially and unequivocally. Ukraine has never had and cannot have any intention of causing any incidents at our own nuclear power plants in our own country. The only force that has the capacity and the motives to cause any such incident is Russia. By acting together and calling out liars now, we can prevent them from executing their malicious plans. Distinguished colleagues, I want to believe that the era of Russian crimes, lies, and denials is coming to an end. Russia is losing its illegal war against Ukraine. Putin's regime is getting weaker by the day, and the latest Wagner mutiny has demonstrated it not only to the whole world, but also to the Russians themselves. Every defeat on the Russian battlefield brings Putin's regime closer to realizing the futility of aggression. We should all work together to bring this realization closer. For when the Kremlin's chief liar realizes no one believes his lies any longer, he will be forced to call a halt to the war. This Council has been unable to take concrete actions in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter for more than 500 days of Russia's full-scale invasion, as well as for more than 9 years of its aggression. And it applies not only to the case of Ukraine, but to other conflicts raging in the world. The root problem is well known, and its name can be found on the fourth plate to the right of the presidency. Despite the fact that this plate was placed on the table more than 3 decades ago, the UN Charter still says nothing about the legitimacy of its presence here. We firmly believe that the future reform of the UN Security Council needs to include an essential component: the decision to deprive Russia of its illegally obtained status as a permanent member and the veto right that comes with it. This Council and the entire world will become a much healthier place once Russia is out of here. While some international organizations are paralyzed by fear of poisonous Russian influence, it is a Ukrainian soldier who assumes responsibility for maintaining peace and security in the world today. A Ukrainian soldier restores peace and security with each step forward and each liberated settlement in Ukraine. Basically putting into action what this Council is supposed to maintain and enforce. This comes at a steep cost, but there is no other choice. Please honor the sacrifice and keep assisting us in bringing peace closer. Ukrainians will always be grateful for your support, and our victory will also be your victory against the scourge of aggression in the world. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kuleba for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Peter Seato, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Well, dear Secretary, dear James, first of all, I'd like to express our appreciation that you give the chance to the neighboring countries to take the floor in this debate as well. I am representing a neighboring country of Ukraine, a country which has been living in the shadow of the war for the last more than 500 days, a war impacts and consequences of which are serious and direct on our country. The Hungarian people have been already paying a high price for this war, although bearing no responsibility for it. In the meantime, I am representing a nation, members of which are among the casualties of this war, given the fact that there's a significant Hungarian community living in Ukraine, around 150,000, members of which, as Ukrainian citizens, are being mobilized to the army in Ukraine, and a lot of them, unfortunately, have already died. And as a representative of a neighboring country and a nation, members of which are dying in this war, I'd like to continue to argue in favor of peace to be created as soon as possible, although I understand this is not falling totally in line with the mainstream positions, and we continue to do so even if we are being criticized and attacked for this position of ours. And as a neighboring country and as a representative of a nation, members of which are dying in this war, we still do believe that the solution is not on the battlefield, but around the negotiating table. And we hear very often that the circumstances and the conditions are not given to launch negotiations to find a diplomatic solution. But allow me to express a different opinion of ours. We do believe that the conditions to launch negotiations to reach a diplomatic solution are getting worse and worse day by day. The longer this war is going to take, the more weapons are occurring in our neighborhood, the more people will die, and the devastation and destruction in our neighborhood will be more and more severe. So we wish that the international community would bring more peace to our neighborhood than weapons. And we all know, Mr. President, that in case we cut the channels of communication, then we literally give up the hope for peace. Therefore, we really do appreciate and respect the efforts to make peace in our neighborhood and the missions which are launched with this target. We'd like to express our respect to the Holy See, to the President of Turkey, and to the African countries, which, although are located far away from the war, but they are confronted with the very serious challenges as an impact of the war as well. And I also would like to highlight the importance of the safe supply of food all around the world, especially in the fragile regions, where shortage of food can very easily cause serious security-related challenges, which for the first time might be local, but then they would spread around the world and become global as well. And they can end up in further migratory waves, which will further increase the global threat of terror. And we all see that we cannot cope with one security-related challenge, so how can we cope with more? Mr. President, unfortunately, if we take into consideration the last 80 years, it's not an exaggeration to say that the global security in its worst shape currently. There are open and shameless references to nuclear capacities. And the chance for the outbreak of the Third World War is more imminent than ever before. And we also see a regrettable long-term consequence that the world is making huge steps in order to be divided into blocks again. And we Central Europeans have very bad historic experiences in this regard, because no one would like to listen to that, and based on history that might be uncomfortable for many to listen to that. But whenever there was a conflict between East and West, we Central Europeans were always left alone, and we always lost on these occasions. So when we argue in favor of a civilized cooperation between East and West, for which we might have some small chance for the future. We do it because this is our national interest. And the longer this war takes, the chance will be much smaller for that. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Siarto for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I would like to thank the United Kingdom for convening this meeting, which is of even more importance in the light of the most recent developments concerning the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia's unilateral withdrawal from the deal generally means one thing. Russia decided to fan the flames of its imperial war against Ukraine with rekindled economic aggression against the most needy and vulnerable states and societies of the Global South. We call on the parties remaining in the initiative to hold to their commitments so essential to the global food market. Mr. President, the Ukrainian people have been fighting Russia's full-fledged aggression for over 500 days now. This blatant violation of the UN Charter by a Security Council permanent member has been the most overwhelming threat to the world peace and security since the Cold War because of its far-reaching and long-lasting consequences. Let me point to three major concerns that this aggression causes for the whole international community. Firstly, the Russian invasion conclusively demonstrates the complex and interlocking nature of threats to international security. We clearly see that this war transcends the Ukrainian and Russian borders, and today's developments, I'm already mentioned, regarding the Black Sea Green Initiative are the most urgent and direct reminder. Neither can we forget about the constant undermining of the security of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which continues to carry enormous potential risks and unpredictable consequences to all of us. Also, the recent destruction of the dam in Novanakovka by Russia brought significant cost to the whole ecosystem of and around the Black Sea and to all its coastal states. Moreover, we have addressed the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in our debates on children in armed conflicts, sexual violence in conflicts, cybersecurity, or destruction of natural heritage. All these aspects require constant attention and determination of the Security Council as the institution responsible for world peace and security. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, secondly, the international law-abiding community cannot tolerate impunity. The perpetrators of international crimes must be held accountable. Each and every aggressor must reckon with legal consequences. Otherwise, they will feel encouraged to continue on the same path. We view accountability as a prerequisite to ensuring a lasting peace in the future. Poland supports the existing institutions such as the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the European Court of Human Rights. We are also engaged practically in the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of Russian aggression. We are glad that a recent meeting of the proposed tribunal's core group took place in Poland. We equally support efforts to establish an international mechanism for reparations for damage caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We also join the enlarged partial agreement on the register of damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine that was adopted at the recent Council of Europe summit in Reykjavik. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, finally, let us remember that in every effort to find peace in Ukraine, we must propose only rightful solutions, as an unjust peace or a frozen conflict would only prolong instability and would attract further aggression. The only sustainable peace solution must be based on the UN Charter and its fundamental principle of territorial integrity. Thus, the international community must remain steadfast in defending the UN Charter. We must continue to put pressure on the aggressor and support the victim in exercising the right of self-defense. The world must keep supporting Ukraine, which is a just cause. We strongly appeal to the UN Security Council members and to the entire UN family to show determination in defending the fundamental principles of the international order. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rao for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, Under Secretary General. Mom, come and get me. These were the words Natalia Shonki had been desperately waiting for. Weeks earlier, Russian troops had arrived at a school in Kupiansk, near Kharkiv in Ukraine. The school Natalia's 15-year-old son, Artem, went to every day like a normal schoolboy. They took Artem and a dozen of his schoolmates away. Natalia told reporters that for weeks she had no idea where he was. She did not know if he was still alive. Then at last, Artem was able to contact her. Mom, come and get me. That's what he told his mother on the phone. It took Natalia months to find her son, to get him back. She managed to travel to the place in Russian-occupied Ukraine where he was being held and took him home, finally, back into her arms. Artem's and Natalia's story is one of many. Since the start of Russia's war of aggression, Russian authorities have transferred and deported thousands of Ukrainian children to Russian-occupied territory and to Russia itself. Those who have been able to return, like Artem, describe shocking experience. How they were forced to speak Russian and to sing the Russian national anthem in Russian children's homes. How their names and ages were changed in order to erase their identity, in order that their parents will never find them again. How they were threatened with being adopted by Russian families. Since I've learned about these crimes, I cannot stop imagining how I would feel if these children were my own 2 little daughters. I know that colleagues from Africa, Asia, Latin America feel the same. During the recent visit to Ukraine and Russia by a delegation of African heads of state and government, they made it very clear that with regard to these children, humanity must come first. So let us work on this issue, especially as I'm aware that we are not on all the same page about every aspect of this war here in this room. But humanity is what unites us. All of us have experienced the tragedy of war in our regions. But an aggressor does not even stop at children. Tragedy turns into horrendous inhumanity. Recognizing this, the African colleagues proposed the return of the deported children as a first confidence-building measure. And I want to wholeheartedly echo their proposal. I would like to invite all of you to join forces with international organizations, Ukrainian authorities and NGOs to investigate Russia's deportations and together find ways to bring these children back home. Despite all our differences, one conviction should be beyond debate. The deported children belong with their parents. They need to be returned home, home to Ukraine, now. To Russia, I would like to say, you can fool yourself, but you cannot fool the world. The world, within the last 500 days, has been to Bucha, to Irpin, to Kharkiv. The world has seen Russian atrocities. The world has spoken to the mothers like Natalia, whose children your government has taken. The horror of the deported Ukrainian children is the tip of the iceberg of the unspeakable suffering that Russia's war has brought to so many children around the world. By bombing roads, blocking ports, and laying mines in grain fields in Ukraine, Russia has been adding fuel to the fire of a global food crisis. As a result, families on every continent struggle to make ends meet, and children go to bed hungry every night. And now, with announcement that it will withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Moscow is threatening even more people, more children, with starvation. By helping to bring down global food prices, this initiative has been a lifeline for the weakest and most vulnerable around the world. As the Secretary General has pointed out this morning, after Russia's pulling out, we immediately saw wheat prices jump. Colleague, it's about humanity. It's about us. I therefore call like us on Russia to stop using hunger as a weapon. Stop abducting children. Stop your illegal war on Ukraine in the name of humanity. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Baerbock for her statements. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean Asselborn, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Luxembourg.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I wish to take this opportunity to thank your country, the United Kingdom, for having organized during your presidency this ministerial meeting on the consequences of war in Ukraine and the prospects of a just and lasting peace. I welcome the participation of my colleague and friend, Ukrainian colleague and friend, Dmitry Peskov. It is an honor for me to speak on behalf of the Benelux countries, namely Belgium, the Kingdom of Netherlands, and my own country, Luxembourg. We align ourselves with the statement to be delivered by the European Union. 9 years ago to the date, on 17 July 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was downed by a Russian missile shot from an agricultural field to the east of Ukraine, territory which at the time was under the effective control of the Russian Federation. 298 people of 17 different nationalities lost their lives, including Dutch people, Belgians, and a family residing in Luxembourg. We reiterate the demand set out in Resolution 2166 of the Security Council for those responsible for this incident to have to be held to account, and for all states to fully associate themselves with the efforts undertaken to establish responsibility. We denounce the disinformation which the Russian Federation has again spread during this meeting. Mr. President, we are profoundly shocked by the devastating impact of the unprovoked, unjustified aggression perpetrated by Russia against Ukraine. A growing number of testimony and reports describe attacks of unbearable brutality perpetrated by the Russian armed forces against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, the sieges of cities in Ukraine, the trafficking of human beings, rapes, and other forms of sexual violence, specifically targeting children and women. We wish to recall the need to implement Security Council resolutions on the protection of civilian infrastructure, specifically Resolution 2601, calling for measures to be taken to protect schools against attacks. For the first time, armed forces and armed groups affiliated with Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, were listed in the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict. And on the ground, indiscriminate attacks have been going on unabated. The Russian aggression has been geared towards destroying the economy of Ukraine. It has also had an impact on food security throughout the world. In this context, we applaud the Black Sea Initiative, which was promoted by the Secretary General of the United Nations. We call for its full implementation and its extension over the long term, and we deplore very much the decision of Russia to suspend its participation. Criminal and penal responsibility is key to guarantee and maintain international peace and security. Peace and justice go hand in hand and are mutually reinforcing. The fight against impunity for the atrocities perpetrated in Ukraine is also important to discourage crimes being perpetrated in the future in Ukraine and in other countries. I also wish to reaffirm our commitment to accountability work for crimes of aggression. We welcome the creation of an international center responsible for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine, which has begun its activities in The Hague. We fully support the efforts undertaken to establish a tribunal responsible for prosecution of the crime of aggression. And we support, lastly, we support the Register of Damage for Ukraine, which has been established by the Council of Europe. I also wish to respond in a sentence to my colleague from Hungary. Hungary is not criticized for investing for a solution to peace, but rather for its positions, which often are geared towards weakening solidarity in terms of sanctions geared towards at least limiting financial means to continue to wage this war. Mr. President, the countries of Benelux support the peace formula presented by President Zelensky. This is a credible peace plan compatible with the Charter of the United Nations as well as the aspirations of the Ukrainian people. The adoption on 23 February last by a large majority of 141 voices, adoption of a resolution of the General Assembly and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations underpinning a global just and lasting peace in Ukraine reflected the international community's support for this peace formula. We support efforts geared towards achieving a peace in line with the Charter of the United Nations, which respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I wish to conclude by reaffirming the full and steadfast solidarity of Benelux countries with the Ukrainian people and government. With our European partners, we shall continue to support Ukraine on the basis of the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, as well as respect for human rights, which we share. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Asselborn for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Karolina Edstadler, Federal Minister for the European Union and Constitution at the Federal Chancellery of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, more than 500 days have passed since Russia launched an unprovoked and unjustifiable war of aggression against its neighbor, Ukraine. This blatant violation of the UN Charter and ongoing aggression and occupation of Ukrainian territory by a permanent member of this Council must not go unaddressed. As members of the international community, we cannot stand idly by while the fundamental principles of our shared legal and security order are under threat. An attack against one member of this organization is an attack against all of us. This is what the UN Charter and our system of collective security imply. In recent decades, significant progress has been made in advancing international law and building guardrails aimed at safeguarding the rule of law. However, faced with such flagrant breach of the Charter, we have no choice but to reiterate that respect for international law is not an option, it is an obligation. We must not accept living in a world where the law of the powerful overrides the rule of law. It is our collective responsibility to work towards a future where might does not make right. Blatant violations of international law must be met with resolute consequences by the international community. The United Nations was created out of the ashes of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust to, and I quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, end of quote, as the Charter states. Yet, the silence of this Council, the most powerful body within this organization, in the face of the Russian aggression, is a fundamental concern. Excellencies, we should never get used to the reality of the war in Ukraine. Indeed, we should never get accustomed to any war around the world. We urgently need a global system capable of responding to these threats, a Security Council that is effective, a Security Council that is representative, reflective of today's world and equipped to tackle the challenges of the 21st century. This war has already led to terrible consequences for the civilian population of Ukraine. Thousands of civilian lives have been lost. Nearly 1/3 of Ukrainians were forced to flee their homes. I have witnessed it myself, the destruction and horrors of this war during my visit to Ukraine last November. I myself had to take shelter from the missiles falling on Kiev. And I saw destroyed residential buildings where so many people lost their lives. Austria vehemently condemns the deliberate attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The humanitarian consequences, such as the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, cannot be overstated. Many of these acts constitute war crimes, and some, as the UN Commission of Inquiry has found, may even amount to crimes against humanity. Recognizing that impunity fuels the cycle of atrocities, the perpetrators must and they will be held accountable. In this regard, my country fully supports all efforts to do so, including by the International Criminal Court. The repercussions of this war extend far beyond Ukraine. They are felt all around the globe. And let me be clear, the impact on food and energy prices around the world are a direct consequence of the Russian aggression. We welcome the leadership of the Secretary General and President Erdogan of Turkey in facilitating the Black Sea Initiative, which reminds us that diplomacy and pragmatism have an important role to play even in these challenging times. We urge Russia to reconsider its decision announced today and to enable the continuation of the Black Sea Initiative. Excellencies, the repeated implicit but unmistakable nuclear threats are unacceptable. The nuclear risks are higher today than they have been in decades, even higher than at the peak of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons hold the potential for catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences. This underscores the urgent need for progress in nuclear disarmament and a departure from the nuclear deterrence paradigm. The international community must ensure that the taboo against any use of nuclear weapons is safeguarded and that any threat or use remains inadmissible. It is essential that the International Atomic Energy Agency secures nuclear energy facilities that have been targeted in this war. We appreciate Director General Gross's proposal in this regard and express gratitude for the dedicated work of the teams on the ground. Excellencies, this war of aggression must end. I call upon the Russian Federation to immediately and without any condition withdraw its forces from all of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And I call on us, let us not grow numb to the horrible consequences of the war, to the suffering of civilians, to the constant threat of nuclear catastrophe, to the economic repercussions felt around the globe. Instead, let us use our collective strength to bring an end to this war and secure a just and lasting peace for Ukraine based on the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Edstadler for her statements. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Giedrė Balčytytė, Chancellor of the Government of Lithuania. You have the floor.
Mr. President, please let me start with a word of appreciation to the United Kingdom Presidency for granting our request to deliver the statement on behalf of Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. I also would like to thank USG DiCarlo for the briefing and the continued engagement of the UN in documenting and reporting crimes committed during Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, spanning now for over or almost a year and a half, as well as for substantial efforts to alleviate global consequences of this brutal war of aggression. Mr. Chairman, as some of the chairs already stated, this war of aggression started well before a year and a half. On this date, 9 years ago, as we all know, Russia shut down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, killing 283 passengers and 15 crew members on board. And we support all efforts to hold Russia and all those responsible accountable for this brutal crime. Though we acknowledge efforts of our global partners in reaching peace in Ukraine, however, Russia cynically continues this unprovoked full-scale war and shows no signs of ending it. Russia manipulates internationally agreed rules, facts, and violates UN Charter and other international agreements, abusing international structures, weaponizing disinformation, and using brutal force. And all this sets precedent for the future. If Russia's actions will be ignored and legitimized this time, future of many countries in the world, those that build peace, prosperity, and sovereignty thanks to the rules-based order, becomes at risk. So we believe that for ensuring comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, certain prerequisites are essential, and I will focus on some of them today. First, Ukrainian peace formula is the guideline we should follow in seeking just and sustainable peace. It gathered strong support in the UN General Assembly, and any attempts to adopt or simplify it would risk at washing out its essence and pandering to Russia's manipulation. Ukraine must have the final say on peace on its own soil. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as countries bordering Russia, will continue our firm stance against appeals to yield to Russia's demands. We all have witnessed Russia's blackmail in relation to the Black Sea Initiative and based on manipulation of facts regarding its grain and fertilizer exports. If Russia would be prioritizing global food security as it claims, it would have stopped inventing obstacles to the work of Joint Coordination Center and continuation of the initiative itself. So we strongly condemn Russia for unilaterally abandoning the Black Sea Grain Initiative and choosing to further aggravate the global food security crisis. Second, a just and lasting peace must be in line with the principles of UN Charter, in particular sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Russia must stop war and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its troops and equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and its territorial waters. As the UN community, we must ensure the protection of the core principles of our cooperation and condemn all those who are actively facilitating Russia's war. Belarus, that participates in this war by providing military equipment, training, and allows its territory to be used for the offensive. Iran, that supports Russia with military equipment, undermining global sanctions. Both must end their assistance to Russia's aggression and return to compliance with international law. Belarus, actually, becoming home for Russian nuclear weapons, as well as elements of Wagner criminal, in Lithuania's position terrorist group, responsible for brutal human rights violations, in addition to Ukraine, also in Mali, CAR, and elsewhere in Africa, where they operate under disguise of so-called security providers. Third, it is essential to recognize that Russia bears sole responsibility for inflicting immense suffering upon the Ukrainian population. The International Criminal Court has issued the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin in relation to the forced deportation of the Ukrainian children. And this is only the first step to bring perpetrators to justice. Russia must be held accountable also for numerous war crimes, including deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure and causing environmental disasters. There should be no hesitation in attributing these crimes. Regarding the crime of aggression, we all need to seek for the establishment of special international tribunal following Ukraine's lead. Mr. President, together we possess capability and determination to assist Ukraine in reconstruction of its schools, hospitals, and roads, and we have already started it without any delay. However, it will take decades for Ukraine and its people to recover from suffering that this war inflicted. No doubt, Ukraine has inherent right of self-defense against the Russian aggression, and we underline the decisions of the EU and NATO leaders offering robust financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. We also welcome the decision regarding strengthening of NATO's eastern flank capabilities adopted in the meeting of the North Atlantic Council in Vilnius last week. So let me reaffirm Estonia's, Latvia's, and Lithuania's strong condemnation of Russia's war against Ukraine and express our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Aggression as an instrument in international relations must be condemned and completely eliminated. Those responsible for Russia's war and use of military force against Ukraine must be brought to justice. We must unite our efforts in pursuit of supremacy of international law. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Balchitite for her statement, and now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Lotte Macon, Deputy Minister for Development Cooperation of Denmark.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. The Nordic countries would like to express our grave concern over the grim humanitarian consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as the war's devastating global implication in areas already affected by humanitarian crisis and food insecurity, such as the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and beyond. All areas demand our immediate attention and concerted efforts. Today, the Nordics would like to share 3 messages on firstly, the grave humanitarian situation in Ukraine, secondly, the global implications of Russia's aggression and the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and thirdly, our support to all meaningful initiatives towards a just peace. On 9 July, several civilian casualties were recorded in yet another Russian attack at a humanitarian aid distribution site in the frontline zone of Orikhiv. Not far from there, Russia's illegal military seizure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to pose devastating and widespread risks in an area already severely affected by the destruction of the Kafkara Dam. Mr. President, we strongly condemn Russia's indiscriminate warfare and intentional attacks on civilians, as well as Iran's provision of drones to Russia in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231 of 2015. All those responsible must be held accountable for violations of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights against Ukraine's civilian population, including the forcible transfer and deportation of children and conflict-related sexual violence. We also call on Russia to ensure full, safe and unhindered access for humanitarian actors to all areas under its temporary military control, as well as to persons detained by Russia or forcibly transferred by Russia, including children. Secondly, we are concerned with the future of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The initiative has helped avoid a further deterioration of the global food crisis amplified by Russia's war of Ukraine. We welcome the active engagement by the Secretary General and Turkey in facilitating the initiative. Since the launch of the initiative, which has safely exported over 32 million tons of grain and foodstuff, we've seen a lowering of global food prices. 56% of the export have gone directly to developing countries. In May, export drops, however, to the lowest volume since the initiative began, largely due to the Russian obstruction in the inspection and registration of shipping vessels. Let us not forget that the Black Sea Grain Initiative would not have been needed had it not been for the Russian aggression, and Russia obviously bears a heavy responsibility for ensuring its continuation and smooth operation, and thus we deeply deplore today's news that Russia has suspended the initiative and urge Russia to ensure a long-term rollover and full implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in line with the Istanbul Agreement, and to urgently lift all impediments that delay operations of the initiative. Mr. President, the Nordics support all meaningful efforts to bring an end to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Such effort must include Russia's complete and unconditional withdrawal of its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine and respect for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We stand ready to support Ukraine's initiative for a just peace and all initiatives seeking to advance peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. And we welcome the G7 Joint Declaration of Support for Ukraine and the intent to build on that framework to ensure Ukraine's long-term security. In closing, the Nordics reaffirm our commitment to the UN founding principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, to the security and well-being of the people in Ukraine and everywhere. Our resolve is unwavering for as long as it takes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Macron for her statement. And I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states and the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, potential candidate country Georgia, the EFTA country Liechtenstein, as well as Andorra, Monaco and San Marino all align themselves with this brief statement. I want to thank the Presidency of the Council for the opportunity to say a few words to the Council, and thanks Under-Secretary General De Carlo for your briefing, and through you the UN system for its continued support to the people of Ukraine under very difficult circumstances, and of course pay tribute and acknowledge the presence of Minister Kuleba here this afternoon. President, we want to reiterate our resolute condemnation of Russia's war on aggression, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter and international law. We also condemn the continued military support for Russia's war of aggression provided by Iran and Belarus. The EU is unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders, as well as its inherent right of self-defense. Allow me to emphasize 3 points in my intervention: the need for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, the importance of addressing the global consequences of Russia's aggression, and the need to hold Russia and its leadership to account. People of Ukraine, the international community, and almost all members of the Council have repeatedly expressed desire for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter, the resolutions of the General Assembly, and international law. We welcome all international efforts to this effect, including the recent visit by African leaders. The EU will sustain support to Ukraine and will continue our work to ensure the widest possible international support for the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula. I underline that with what so many others have said this afternoon, that any initiative for sustainable peace in Ukraine must be based on full respect for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. On the global consequences, we condemn Russia's decision to unilaterally terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We thank the UN and the Secretary General and all involved for their efforts in attempting to reach an agreement. The initiative's suspension creates widespread uncertainty on global markets and exacerbates the dire situation of food importing countries, hurting the poorest and the most vulnerable the most. Russia continues to weaponize food and undermine global food security. At a time when 258 million people face hunger, this is deeply irresponsible. While continuing to commit its flagrant violation of the UN Charter, Russia now, piece by piece, undermines the multilateral system, blocking Security Council action for humanitarian assistance to Syria, and now preventing the extension under UN auspices of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Since its signing in Istanbul last year, the initiative has eased pressure on global food prices by facilitating the export of more than 32 million metric tons of foodstuff. Contrary to what the Russian representative earlier said, according to the UN, over half of exports went to developing countries, and the proportion of wheat exported to least developed countries, including sub-Saharan Africa, remained largely unchanged from pre-war levels. Furthermore, Ukraine is one of the main suppliers of the World Food Programme, which, without this initiative, would now have to source its humanitarian assistance elsewhere at higher costs. The EU spared no effort to support the UN in reaching a deal and finding a compromise allowing the renewal. So we urge Russia to reconsider its decision and resume the implementation of the initiative. Let's not forget that the Black Sea Grain Initiative would not have been necessary if Russia had not started the full-scale war against Ukraine and blocked Ukrainian Black Sea ports. In addition to the grain initiative, the EU solidarity lanes remain instrumental in bolstering global food security. They have allowed the export of more than 38 million tons of Ukraine's food and agricultural goods. The EU and the member states remain committed to addressing the needs of countries vulnerable to food insecurity. That is why we are providing 18 billion euros to address food security needs globally, focusing on the most vulnerable regions. We reiterate our call on all countries to step up their assistance in line with OCHA's humanitarian response plan and appeal for aid this year. Finally, on accountability, we remain firmly committed to ensure that Russia is held fully accountable for its war of aggression against Ukraine. The International Center for the Prosecution of Crime of Aggression against Ukraine has started its support operations in The Hague. The work to establish a tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine will continue. We welcome the adoption of the Ljubljana and The Hague Convention on International Cooperation in the Investigation and Prosecution of the Crime of Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other international crimes, and call on all countries to become parties to the Convention as soon as possible. We also welcome the establishment of the Council of Europe's Register for damage caused by the aggression, and calls for work to continue in line with the resolution of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, we need a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter and the resolutions of the General Assembly. We will continue to provide strong financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skoog for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.